I do. You ready? A B A Hey, there are a lot of you here today, and I know you can be an awesome audience. To be an awesome audience, guess what you gotta do? First, you gotta make sure you're sitting crisscross. Next thing you need to do, you need to make sure your eyes and your ears are all facing this way. Got it? And the next thing you need to do is that you need to listen to a very, very cool person, Dr. Bennett. This is Dr. Bennett. He will be teaching you lots of cool things about something that's big.
Space!
And it's in the sky.
Space!
Not space. It starts with that letter. So, do me a favor. Give your best attention to Dr. Bennett. Enjoy.
Thank you very much. You know, I've seen all of you many times before, but I had no idea that so many of you were twins. If I could get everybody's attention. Today, I'm going to read you the story of Max Goes to the Moon, and we'll talk about some of the science as we go through. What I need everybody to do is to stay very, very quiet. Stay very, very quiet so that everyone can hear. If you think of a question as we go along, I want you to keep it in your head, and maybe we'll have some time for questions at the end. I hope so. Now, before we start, I actually have a question for you, which as you can see here on the screen, there's Max wearing his spacesuit on the moon. Is this a true story? It turns out this is not a true story. Max didn't really go to the moon. In fact, he didn't even own a spacesuit. However, he was a very real dog, as you can see in this picture. And you can see from this picture that Max was a very, very big dog, but he was also a very, very friendly dog. The book starts with a dedication page. It says, "To children around the world, follow your dreams, study hard, and someday you'll live in a world as wonderful as we imagine in this book." And of course it says imagine because it's not a true story, but it's the kind of story that could come true someday. This is the story of how Max the dog helped people return to the moon, this time to stay. It all began on the morning of the parade. Max had just returned from his trip to the space station. He was a hero. After all, none of the astronauts could have come home safely without him. As Max's car drove along Pearl Street, he looked to the west and he began to howl, just as the moon set over the mountains. In truth, Max howled because he heard a siren. He always howls at sirens. But the TV reporters didn't know that, so they thought he was howling at the moon. A reporter spotted Max's friend Tori. "Why did Max howl at the moon?" he asked. "I'm not sure," said Tori. "Maybe it's because he wants to go there." And if you look at this picture here, you'll see there's Max and his friend Tori, and there's the TV reporter asking the question. You might even notice that right up there on the hill, it's probably hard to see on the screen, but there's actually an ambulance up there, so that was where the siren was coming from that he was really howling at, but they thought he was howling at the moon. And if you look very closely at this moon, and again, I know especially for those of you in the back, it's a little hard to see, but if you look closely at this moon, you'll notice that that moon has an interesting shape to it. It's not quite a full moon, but we're definitely seeing more than half the moon. So this is a moon that's in between half and full. And it turns out that the moon has a very special name when it looks like this. But for some reason, hardly anybody knows it, although I think there might be someone here who does. Raise your hand if you know what that's called.
Gibbous.
Gibbous. Excellent. You know, usually when I come to schools, hardly anyone knows that, but you guys are really, really smart, because I heard a lot of people knew that. But I want to make sure everyone remembers it. So can you all say gibbous for me?
Gibbous.
Again.
Gibbous.
Louder.
Gibbous.
Good. Now, I need you to be as silent as you can possibly be, but stand up, please. And show me very, very silently with your arms a full moon. Right, we all know how to make a full moon. That's pretty easy. I bet you can also show me a crescent moon. Can you show me a crescent moon? A crescent moon has just a little bit of bright and all the rest dark. Now, if you think about it, you'll see that our gibbous moon is the opposite of a crescent. Instead of a little bit bright and all the rest dark, it's got a little dark and all the rest bright. So to make it, make your full moon again. And now on one side, just take a little bit out. So we're almost, but not quite all the way full. And what do we call it?
Gibbous.
Again.
Gibbous.
Louder. Louder.
Gibbous.
That's pretty good, but I'm worried that Miss Potes can't hear you in the office. So on the count of 3, make sure that the entire school can hear you, okay? 1, 2, 3. That was good. You can sit back down. Remember, even though a lot of you were so smart, you knew to give a spoon, it turns out that most people don't. And you know what I bet? I bet most of your parents don't even know it's called the give a spoon. So the next time you go out in the outside and you see the moon looking like that, where it's almost but not quite full, I want you to take your parents out there and teach them something, okay? You tell them, Mom, Dad, that's the... Excellent. Now back to the story. Remember, Tori said, well, maybe he wants to go there to the moon. Well, Tori's maybe was good enough for TV. By the next day, Max's dream of going to the moon was all over the news. And because no one had been to the moon in a long time, it seemed like it was about time for someone or some dog to go. Remember, we need to keep our questions till the end, please. It's not easy to go to the moon. It takes big rocket engines to get a spaceship off Earth. It takes careful planning to make sure the astronauts reach the moon and come back safely, and it costs a lot of money. But everywhere Max went, crowds chanted, "Send Max to the moon!" People wrote letters to the president. So a new moonship was built and assembled at the space station. And in this painting, you can see the space station, and you see down here this round thing with the 4 legs. That's the moonship that they're building. Tori gave Max the good news. "You're going to the moon," she said. "I sure hope they let me come with you." Max went into astronaut training again. The other astronauts were glad to have Max back. Max made the long training session seem fun. Somehow he always managed to find a stick. He loved to play fetch while the astronauts trained in the water tank. He also loved to play tug-of-war. And guess who always won?
Max.
That's a pretty good guess. You know, Max, remember I showed you that picture of him? He was really big, and he was really strong, and he used to love to play tug-of-war with me, and he always won. He also played tug-of-war with other grown-ups, and he always beat them too. In fact, you know what? Max never actually played tug-of-war with any of the Denver Broncos. But if he'd played tug-of-war with the biggest, strongest football player on the Denver Broncos, he would have still won because he was so strong. And you know what? Here's the surprising thing. If I had brought him here to school and he had played tug-of-war with one of you, well, of course I know you would have pulled as hard as you could, right? And he would have pulled back. And you would have pulled as hard as you could, right? And he would have pulled back. And then you would have pulled as hard as you could, and he would have let go, and you would have won. Do you know what? This is true. Max loved kids so much that whenever he played tug-of-war with a kid, he always let the kid win. Never once did he let a grown-up win. Tori thought Max should know a little history before his trip, so she told Max about the first astronauts who went to the moon. Listen carefully, Max. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first people to walk on the moon. Their mission was called Apollo 11. They landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong stepped out first. Do you know what he said when he took his first moon step? He said, "That's one small step for a man, One giant leap for mankind. Do you understand, Max? Max barked, and Tori took it as a yes. Good boy, Max, said Tori. Now in this painting, you can see what it really did look like a little more than 40 years ago when those astronauts went to the moon. There's the two astronauts, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. There's the spaceship that they landed in on the moon. There's the flag that they put on the moon. And if you think about it, some of you may notice that that flag
It's still there.
looks like it's doing something that it should not be doing on the moon. Who can tell me what that is? Yes.
Blowing.
It looks like it's blowing. And why shouldn't it be blowing on the moon?
There's no wind.
There's no air and no wind on the moon. Very, very good. So the flag is not actually blowing. It's just hanging there. It couldn't be blowing because there's no wind on the moon. But that brings up another question. And the question is, why is the flag staying up and hanging like that instead of falling down? And I see lots of hands up, which means you probably know the right answer. But guess what? I'm not going to call on you. Why? Because I prefer to tell you the wrong answer. Okay, now I know you're probably thinking, why are you going to tell us the wrong answer instead of the right answer? But you know what? It's a little bit embarrassing. It's what a lot of grown-ups think. You know how sometimes grown-ups have a little trouble with science?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know why that is, right? Because the way science works is we use our eyes and our ears and our powers of observation to see the world around us. And kids are really good at that. And then we use our brains to think hard about what those things we see in the world mean and what could explain them. And kids are really good at that too. For some reason, sometimes when people get older, they forget how to do those things. So you need to straighten them out. If you hear adults telling you strange things about science, you can fix it. And this is one of those cases, because you know what kind of crazy things they say about this flag? A lot of adults will say, well, there's no gravity on the moon.
There's a little bit.
Yeah.
There's a tiny bit, but not.
I see a couple people laughing. What about the rest of you? Right. Because you can all tell, probably you were just stunned, because it's such a crazy answer, right? I mean, look at the picture. Everybody looking? You can tell there's gravity on the moon just by looking at the picture, right? How can you tell there is gravity on the moon by looking at the picture? Right. The spaceships landed, the astronauts are walking around. If there's no gravity, they'd be floating away. So obviously, there is gravity on the moon. So if, this is very, very important, listen very, very carefully. If any grown-up ever tries to tell you that there's no gravity on the moon, please don't laugh too hard. It will hurt their feelings. You can giggle a little bit because it is a completely crazy answer. And then just say, oh, silly grown-up, look at the picture. You can tell from the picture that there is gravity on the moon because they're walking there. And then, of course, the grown-up will say, oh, yeah? Well, then why is the flag staying up? And you say, well, obviously, they just stuck a pole through it so it wouldn't fall down. NASA chose 6 experienced astronauts to go to the moon with Max. Since Max and Tori made such a good team, Tori got to go along too. So the crew of 7 humans and 1 dog blasted off into space. Within a few hours, they were docked at the space station where their moonship was waiting. After lunch on the space station, the crew boarded the moonship. The crew fired the moonship's rocket engines to gain speed, leaving Earth orbit. Once on their way, they turned off the engines and coasted toward the moon. The trip took a little more than 2 days. Soon the moon loomed large in the window with Earth far behind. The crew turned the ship around, so firing the rocket engines slowed it down. As the moonship neared the surface, the blast from its engines kicked up a cloud of moon dust. Then it settled gently onto the moon. Max was so excited about reaching the moon that the crew had a hard time getting his spacesuit on. It took 3 of them just to hold Max while the others pulled the spacesuit over his legs. Tori made sure that Max's tail went in the right place. Then they closed all the buckles and attached his helmet. Finally, they checked carefully to make sure the spacesuit was airtight. When they opened the airlock, Max jumped out. You should have seen the look on his face. He went much higher and farther than he'd expected. It also took him much longer to come down than he was used to on Earth. Tori watched out the window and said, "That's one giant leap for a dog." Who can tell me why Max went so much higher and farther than he expected. And remember, there is gravity on the moon, but something must be different about that gravity, right? What's different about it?
There's less gravity on the moon than on Earth.
Excellent. There's less gravity on the moon than on Earth. So if I can get you all to be very, very silent again and stand up, please. And very, very silently on the count of 3. I need everybody to jump as high as they can. 1, 2, 3. Again, 1, 2, 3. One more time. 1, 2, 3. Good, and you can all sit back down, and you should all be very, very thankful that you were not injured in that jump. And the reason you were not injured in that jump was because you did not smash your head into the ceiling. Why didn't you smash your heads into the ceiling? Because of? Gravity! Gravity, that's right. On Earth we have lots of gravity, so when we jump up, we don't get so high before gravity pulls us back down. Maybe about that high, a couple feet. But if you do the same jump on the moon, well, there's gravity on the moon too, so on the moon, gravity will also bring you back down. But because there's less gravity, you'll go a little higher. How much higher? It turns out you'll go about 6 times as high on the moon, which means if you got your feet about 2 feet off the ground on Earth, on the moon, your feet would have gone 12 feet off the ground. Well, there's about 6. Well, guess what? That ceiling's probably about 12 feet. Which means if we had done the same jump on the moon, you would have crashed your head into the ceiling and you'd be hurting really bad right now. But that's the bad news. The good news is if you were playing basketball on the moon, well, you may know that basketball hoops are 10 feet high, which means that all of you on the moon could jump not only high enough to dunk the basketball, you could have your feet go completely over the hoop. Anybody want to play basketball on the moon? Oh, yeah! For posterity, the astronauts landed off the spot where Max made his first paw prints on the moon. Those paw prints are still there today, even though there's no wind or rain, because there's no wind or rain on the moon. Max decided it would be fun to play with a stick. He didn't see any, so he decided to look behind a big rock. But when he poked his head into the rock's shadow, he couldn't see a thing. It was darker than the darkest night, and cold, too. Max leaped backward with a look of surprise and worry. Tori bounded over to calm him down. "It's okay, Max. You're a good dog. Just try to stay out of the shadows. Anyway, you won't find any sticks on the moon. Nothing lives here, so there aren't any trees. Here, I brought a Frisbee to play with." And there you can see Tori pulling the Frisbee out of her backpack. Tori got off a good throw, even though her big spacesuit glove made it a little hard to hold the Frisbee. Max bounded after it, but it didn't curve the way Max expected, and he missed it by a lot. Tori quickly realized why Max was confused. He didn't know that objects move differently when there's no air. Tori picked up a rock and pulled a feather from her pack. "Look at this feather," she explained to Max. "On Earth, the air would make it float gently to the ground. But there's no air here on the moon, so it falls plunk, just like the rock." And so then let's think about what that would do to a Frisbee. On Earth, when you throw a Frisbee, it curves. But what makes the Frisbee curve, everybody? Air, right. So if you throw a Frisbee on the moon, well, you can still throw it. In fact, because of the less gravity, you can throw it much higher and farther than you can on Earth. But because there's no air, it will not curve. No matter what you do, it will only go perfectly straight. And that's why Max had been confused. Tori picked up the Frisbee and threw it again. This time, Max knew what to do. She threw it very high, so Max had time to get under. He stopped and turned around to see the Frisbee coming down. He was perfectly positioned for the catch. Can you all show me what a dog looks like when they're about to catch a Frisbee? Very, very good. There was only one problem. Yes, I think you can all see the problem there. Helmet. Max, Tori, and the astronauts had plenty of work to do for the next few days. They collected moon rocks for science, and they set up telescopes to study distant planets and stars. But most of all, they loved gazing upward at Earth, which seemed to hang in one place in the sky. And you see, we walk around on Earth, and we look up in the sky and we see the moon. But if you were on the moon, you'd look up in the sky and see Earth. And we see the moon go through phases. You would see Earth go through phases. What kind of Earth would you call that? Crescent Earth, right. Soon the longer shadows told Max and the crew that darkness was coming. It was time to leave. Once everyone was aboard the moon ship, Max and Tori waved goodbye to the moon and the crew closed the door. They fired the rocket engines and blasted off the moon. Just 12 days after leaving the Earth, Max, Tori, and the rest of the astronauts were back on the space station. Then a space shuttle took them home. Back on Earth, billions of people watched Max's trip on the news. Everyone talked about it. Some grown-ups said the trip wasn't worth the money it cost. But children understood the excitement of it all. They asked their parents to help send Max to the moon again, but this time to build a big colony where many children could go visit him and learn about the universe. The children were so convincing that all the nations of the world decided to work together to build a big dome colony on the moon. The domes covered homes, offices, and of course the University of the Moon. They were filled with air so no one needed a spacesuit inside. Food grew in greenhouses and water was carefully recycled. Outside the domes, astronauts built great telescopes to observe the universe. Students and scientists made important new discoveries almost every day. The building of the moon colony also changed a lot of things back on Earth. Children tried to learn more in school in hopes that they might get to attend the University of the Moon. How many of you would like to go to college on the moon? Me! Sounds pretty good, huh? Grown-ups, save the money for tourist trips to the moon. Most importantly, the beautiful views of Earth from the moon made everyone realize that we all share a small and precious planet. And if you look very carefully at the painting, you can see our small and precious planet right up there in the sky, and how beautiful it looks. And you might also notice that in this particular painting, our small and precious planet, well, it's not quite full, just almost, which means it is called gibbous. Right, again. Louder. And one more time on the count of 3 for the people downtown. 1, 2, 3. Awesome. Of course, none of it would happen without Max. Max was glad he had been so helpful, but he was not the kind of dog to stop at that. It's a big universe out there. Where would he go next?
Mars.
I guess that's a pretty easy question since he goes to Mars next. What about after Mars? Jupiter. That was pretty easy too, but what about after Jupiter? Oh, I hear a lot of good ideas, but guess what? I haven't written the next book yet, so I don't know where he's going. There's an activity for teachers to do the phases. I get everybody's attention. How many people would like to see some more pictures of Max? Then I need all those people to be very, very quiet, please. There's a picture of Max with me, and I wrote the story, but I did not paint the paintings. There's our artist, Alan Okamoto. And if everybody can stay very quiet with me, I'll show you a few more pictures of the real Max so you can get to know him a little bit better. How many of you have been to a wedding? How many of the girls have been flower girl at a wedding? Oh, well, you see, Max, he was a flower dog. Some of you might know a little girl in this school named Brooke. And this is Brooke when she was very little with Max, and you can see here that she really loved him, and he was a very, very friendly dog. In fact, there's Max with Brooke's big brother, Grant, and there's Max showing you that he was so large that 2 kids could sit on top of him at the same time. Now, you may wonder, what was Max's personality like? And this picture shows you, because you see Brooke when she was like 1 year old, she used to like to put dog biscuits in his mouth, but because she was only 1, she didn't realize that after you put the dog biscuit in his mouth, you're supposed to let go of it. So she'd just leave her hand in there with the dog biscuit. And Max was so gentle that he would just use his tongue to slowly pull the dog biscuit out of her hands. In fact, she had so much fun feeding him at regular mealtime that you know they tell you not to bother a dog when it's eating? That's good advice. But with Max, turned out it didn't matter. She saw him going to eat, she would run over and take her little tiny 1-year-old hand against his giant dog head and shove it out of the food bowl. And then he would just look sad for a minute, until she reached in and let him eat out of her hands.
He's small.
You remember in the story, he goes swimming in the water tank with the astronauts?
Yeah.
He really did love to swim, as you can see there. And you remember in the story, it all gets started when he howls at the siren, but they think he's howling at the moon? He really did howl at sirens. And I want you all to watch my hands. Okay, when I go like that, that's your signal for immediate silence. Got it? So when you see me do this, I want you all to become totally, immediately silent, okay? But on the count of 3, while you're watching for the silent signal, I want to hear your best dog howl. 1, 2, 3. Oh, very, very good. Very, very good. Everyone always asks me, what is Max doing in this picture? And you know what? I'm not totally sure. I think maybe he was hoping to be one of the reindeer on Santa's sleigh. But I don't think that costume would have fooled Santa, do you? And that is where I stop. If we have time, we can do a few questions, but I know you're on kind of a tight schedule.
We have time for a few.
Okay, and so why don't we start with first grade teachers? You can call on someone from your class to ask. Everybody be quiet.
Boys and girls, a question is something that you wonder. Not a story, but I wonder how or when or why. Okay? So
If you're called on, stand up, please, so I can hear you.
Why was Max wearing the costume? Was it Halloween or Christmas?
You know, I think that might have been a Halloween costume, actually.
Very.
Very good. Very good. Let's see if we have some space questions or writing or science questions.
Are you going to make the next book?
Am I going to make the next book? You know, I do think I will do another one, but I haven't started on it, so I'm not quite sure when yet. Thank you.
Oh, okay now. How now with us?
Another? Teachers?
one more question and another question.
Is it Angelina?
Kate, stand up.
Yes, Max was our dog, and we have a new dog now named Cosmo, who you will get to meet here at school sometime.
Anybody with a space question?
Here we have one in the back. I need everybody quiet so I can hear the question, please. You know, that's a good question. The question is, how many books am I going to make? You know, I could send them to all the planets. How many would that be? 9. Depends on if you count Pluto or not, right? Okay. So, but you know what?